Hello everyone. For today's class, I'm coming to you from outside in my backyard because it's so sunny and nice and springtime here in Vermont. And for today's class, what we're talking about is the menstrual life cycle. This is often something that we're not really taught about in its fullness, in its richness in health classes, at the doctor's office, or even from our family and friends. Often we're taught in like excruciatingly uncomfortable health classes in elementary, middle, or high school that, you know, we're gonna get a period, we're gonna bleed, it's gonna be uncomfortable, we're gonna wanna hide it, here are some products to kind of manage it as best as you can, and it's just presented as this like big inconvenience that we'll have to deal with, as well as like this huge risk, because it puts us in a position of being able to get pregnant at an age when we don't want that in our modern life. So we're not really given an empowering introduction to menstruation and our menstrual cycles, and therefore our bodies. And then the pregnancy aspect of the menstrual life cycle is really the only one that really gets celebrated, right? We have baby showers, we have all different types of celebrations and gatherings around the pregnancy year, the childbirth, and that is celebrated. And then when we think about perimenopause and menopause, we again go back into hushed tones, avoiding the topic. Really, none of us are receiving a proper education on perimenopause, menopause, and what to even expect, because we're not given that education in school and not really given much of an introduction to it from our doctors, other than when symptoms start smacking us in the face. And one, that doesn't need to be the case, because menopause doesn't have to be awful and filled with a ton of symptoms. We can do a lot of prep work beforehand to kind of avoid that from happening, so it can too be a celebratory event. And so I kind of shared this introduction because it's important to know that I live near an airport. That's important to know. It's also important to note that we're not given an empowering introduction to our menstrual life cycle. We're not even really given access to all aspects of our menstrual life cycle. We're not educated on those things. And so we have to seek out that education ourselves. And so I'm so happy you're here watching this video. Now, when we talk about the menstrual life cycle, there's a few distinct parts of that life cycle. The first is menarche. This is probably a term you haven't heard before. It's not often used in schools or in health classes or even in the doctor's office, but menarche is the term for your first period, or the onset of menstruation. In traditional matriarchal cultures, in our traditional menstrual lineages, ancient menstrual lineages, this moment in time would be a rite of passage that would be celebrated, right? The beginning of menstruation, this beginning to bleed, beginning to enter into your cyclical lifestyle, would be met with celebration. We would gather in sisterhood with our mothers, our aunts, our sisters, our friends, our community members who could help us celebrate that transition, that induction into being a cyclical being living in a cyclical body. And there would be time to pause and celebrate a young woman as she comes into this rite of passage. And I think it's time that we really reclaim that we reclaim menarche as a moment of celebration, as a rite of passage, as a magnificent transformation from one way of living into another, from linear living into cyclical living. And there's so much richness that comes with that transformation. And when we're taking time to pause and really celebrate the onset of menstruation, we can also educate. We can also share with young women, with young girls in this place, how to support their menstrual cycles through the foods that they eat, the way that they live, the activities that they take place in, their movement practice, as well as give them tools for living a cyclical lifestyle, information on cycle syncing, on living in alignment with their new cycle, and how to really embrace the shifting phases and use them to their advantage to really experience a rich, whole existence as a cyclical being. And we can use that as an opportunity to teach and impart menstrual cycle rituals onto the young girls in our lives. And with that, we can teach them menstrual tea rituals, yoni steaming, castor oil packs, womb meditations, a whole host of rituals that can really allow us to have more enjoyable cycles and to really boost and support the onset of menstruation. Because as I'm sure you experienced yourself or the girls in your own life, that those early periods are quite tough. They can be painful, they can be long, they can be irregular and unpredictable, and that's not outside of the norm for a new menstruating human because our body's never done this before. It needs some time to get the hang of it and to really get good at ovulating, which then creates the menstrual bleed. So when we rush to suppress our early cycles with birth control because we're not getting a period every month or we're having difficult symptoms, we're really doing ourselves a disservice because we're not pausing to nourish, care for, and support the onset of menstruation so that we get better at it as time goes on, just like riding a bike. And so celebrating menarche as a rite of passage allows us to do that. It allows us to pause, celebrate, impart wisdom, tools, and practices onto new menstruating humans so that they can nourish their cycles and have healthier cycles at an earlier age, which many of us, millennials and older, were not able to do because this information wasn't given to us. This celebration wasn't provided to us. Many of us hid our early menstrual experiences in shame and secrecy and hushed tones because we were kind of taught or observed that that's how things should be. So phase 1 is menarche, and it deserves a party, a celebration. You can bet if I have a daughter, we are celebrating that hardcore. Then from there, we have menstruation, right? The next step in the menstrual lifestyle from menarche is your menstruating years, where you have your monthly cyclical bleed, which means you're having monthly cyclical ovulation, and you're doing that supportive work, nourishing your menstrual cycle through food, movement, lifestyle changes, perhaps some supplements and rituals as well. And that is where we're living as a cyclical being. Those are our cyclical years when we're in that menstruating vibe. And that's really all we're kind of taught too much about in our early sex ed or health ed classes. And then we're taught about the next phase of the menstrual life cycle, pregnancy, and we're mostly taught like that it exists, right? That's pretty much it. Once you have a menstrual cycle, then sperm and egg can meet anytime you have sex and boom, you can get pregnant. And that's pretty much all we're taught about getting pregnant. And if anyone has tried to get pregnant, you probably know that's not really the case. It's not exactly that straightforward or that simple. First of all, you can't get pregnant every time you have sex. You can get pregnant around 6 to 7 days a month at most. And that is simply because of the lifespan of an egg once it's ovulated is only 24 hours. The lifespan of sperm inside your body is about 5 to 6 days from the point of ejaculation. So sperm lives in your body for 5 to 6 days, waiting for an egg to be released. Then it has 1 day to do the job, and then you're not fertile again for the rest of that cycle. So one, we're never ever taught that information in a health class, right? We're not trusted with that information in our own bodies, despite that that's the truth about how our bodies work. So that is a huge disservice to us and how we could live our lives, especially when it comes time to trying to conceive. And then we're also taught that pregnancy is simply sperm and egg meet and you're pregnant. That's also not true. That's the beginning part of the process. That is called fertilization. But sperm can fertilize the egg and conception can still not happen. Pregnancy can still not take place. And that's because there's a second part of this event called implantation. And we'll go into how pregnancy happens deeper in another video. But just to give you a sense of this, implantation is when that fertilized egg attaches itself to the lining of the uterus. If that doesn't happen in a cycle, you won't get pregnant. And there are a lot of conditions we need in place for both fertilization and implantation to happen. We are not given access to what that information is in our sex ed or health ed classes. In the other video that I just referenced, you will get access to that. You will know how to support that, but that's beyond the scope of this video here. And so we're taught about menarche, right? And we're kind of taught to like shove it down, make sure nobody knows it's happening, and suppress it when really we should be celebrating it. And then we're taught about menstruation, and we're taught that it's going to be kind of awful and inconvenient and uncomfortable, and to continue suppressing it and hiding it. Again, not the case. It deserves ritual and celebration and nourishment. And then we're taught that pregnancy can happen, and really, really quickly, and that's really all we're taught about it. And then when it comes time to getting pregnant, we learn that's a bit more complicated than that. But this is the one event in the menstrual life cycle that we actually do have celebrated for us in our communities, right? So we have lots of celebration around pregnancy. People are always so excited, especially when usually when it's a planned pregnancy, right? Unplanned pregnancies take on a little bit different of an energy, but let's go, for the sake of this conversation, with when we are trying to conceive, pregnancy happens, a lot of celebration, a lot of excitement around that moment. And that's the only moment in the menstrual life cycle that our modern society celebrates, which is really, really a huge disservice. And if you think about it, pregnancy is being celebrated because we're creating new life. We're kind of celebrating something like outside of ourselves, outside of the menstrual cycle, right? It like stops the menstrual cycle so that we can create this life. It involves another person. We kind of think about it in like the patriarchal lineage. It often involves a male, right? So we're like celebrating our bodies in relationship to men. And again, that's a big disservice. There are so many other places in our menstrual life cycles that deserve celebration. Pregnancy is without a doubt one of those things, but it's not the only thing. And that's really important to make note of. So then we're pregnant, we celebrate pregnancy, this is great. Then we have birth, which is the next phase of the menstrual life cycle for those who do get pregnant or choose to get pregnant. And we go through birth, which is again met with celebration. However, met with celebration for the new baby. Oftentimes the birthing mother is like forgotten about, right? Once the baby's here, all eyes, all attention is going towards that baby, and we forget about the birthing mother, her recovery process, her emotional, physical, and energetic needs at that time. And that deserves not only support and nourishment, but what mom just went through, she deserves celebration for that too. And that's another thing that's getting overlooked in our modern society. Then from there, we go back into menstruating, right? And we may get pregnant several times or we may not. And then from there, we enter into perimenopause. For reference, all the symptoms we hear related to menopause, like insomnia, night sweats, hot flashes, dry skin, etc., that is all associated with perimenopause. Menopause itself is great and wonderful and often free of symptoms. Menopause begins at the 12-month mark after your last period bleed. So menopause is what you enter into a year after you've stopped bleeding. Perimenopause is that phase before, where things can be a little rocky as our body is descending out of its ovulatory, out of its menstrual years. And so there's a ton of support we can do to make perimenopause a much more enjoyable experience, just like that support we do to make our periods more enjoyable, beyond the scope of this video again, but there's a bunch of content that you can find on this coming to you in the membership as well. But it's important to recognize perimenopause because from that comes menopause, which is a huge rite of passage in the life cycle of a menstruating being. That is when we enter into what we call our crowning years. And it deserves so much celebration. We're stepping into the role of the wise woman, right? So before, we may have been, with menarche, we're like the maiden woman. And then with pregnancy, we're the mothering woman. With perimenopause, we're like this wild woman. And then when we come into those croning menopausal years, we are the wise woman. We have all this wisdom we've gathered throughout our lives and all this wisdom that lives in our bodies throughout our menstrual life cycle that we can now share and impart onto the women and girls around us. This is a very important role to take, not only within your families and within your own circles, but within the greater communities. And I love croning, and I think we all should be throwing our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunts, our sisters, big croning parties to celebrate that moment where they enter into their role as the wise woman. And yet you'll probably recognize that in our modern society, croning is like really, really, really not embraced, right? We have all these things like wrinkle creams and Botox and hair dye. We're constantly trying to look younger, be younger, ignore the aging process. That's not what croning's about. Croning says embrace that aging process. Embrace entering your wise years. Own that shit. You earned it. And so rather than shunning and looking at the aging women in our society as like washed up or unimportant, or just to kind of like let them quietly do their aging thing over there, we need to tap into them. They have wisdom that we need that can help us. And so by honoring croning and the menopausal phase of the life cycle, we're accessing a whole host of information that current modern society is completely disregarding. And we really, really, really need to wake up to that. And so for the sake of not having this video go on for 100 million years, I just want to say that I wanted to share about the menstrual life cycle in the many different phases to recognize that we are not at the current time doing enough to celebrate these important rites of passage. And I hope that with this video, you feel inspired to celebrate these rites of passage in your own lives and in the lives of the women and girls around you. There are so many things we can do for menarche parties, for croning parties. You've seen all the stuff for the baby showers and the mothering parties, right? And so we can take celebrations and incorporate rituals around bleeding, around entering into our wise years, and around birth, really celebrating the mother, the birthing mother, and loving her up. And so I'll share some rituals that we can do for the menstrual life cycle rites of passage in another video. But for now, take some time to really sit with how you want to celebrate your menstrual rites of passage and the rites of passage for the women and the girls in your own life. And please, please, please take the time to celebrate these rites of passage and to help the women and girls going through them feel really empowered by the experience, empowered by menarche, their first menstruation, empowered with each monthly bleed, empowered in their pregnancy and birthing experiences, empowered as they enter into menopause and those croning wise years. Build up your fellow women and teach them that they can celebrate these very important rites of passage that happen as a part of being a cyclical being. So thank you so much for joining me for this chat on the menstrual life cycle. Again, stay tuned for more information on the types of rituals and celebrations we can do that line up with each of these very important rites of passage. Until next time, happy cycling.